Do you think that China, in fact, has slowed down, and I use that as a relative term, to 7.7% in the second quarter? And how alarmed are you that we see the import numbers falling, growth numbers falling, manufacturing numbers falling as we speak?
I think there is definitely a concern that the momentum in Chinese economic growth has slowed down for about 9 months now. But I think the evidence still indicates that China will have a soft landing rather than a hard landing. The trade data that we saw today is still positive year on year, although it's momentum clearly has slowed down as well. And I think other indicators are also still showing expansion, but at a more moderate pace. And I think the key to the outlook for the second half of the year is the policy responses by the Chinese government to the slowing of the economy. And I think one clear response that we've already seen is that as inflation has come down and it's now down to around 2%, they've felt comfortable to ease monetary policy. And we've seen 2 rate cuts and 3 reserve requirement ratio cuts in the last few months. So that's, I think, an indication of one policy response. And I think there'll be more reserve requirement cuts in coming weeks and months.
As we speak, Rajiv, you're sitting in Singapore, and there was a big concern a few years ago that China would swamp the ASEAN nations with its gigantic growth and its exports and undermine the ASEAN nations. We have 10 countries within that group, and their top export markets remain China, Japan, and the U.S. And those same 3 nations top the list of their import sources right now. When does the slowdown in China and the slowdown in India really undermine this market of better than 600 million consumers in your neck of the woods?
I think what we've seen in the last 10 years is a growing export momentum between ASEAN and China. China has become more and more important as a key export market for the ASEAN countries. And in fact, that's been a key driving force in their export growth in the last decade. Now, if we see China slowing down, of course, this is going to be a significant risk for many of the ASEAN countries who are quite trade dependent. Countries like Thailand, Malaysia, Philippines are quite trade dependent, and Singapore, of course, even more so. But I think when you look at Indonesia, which is the big player in ASEAN, it's the biggest economy, and I think when you look at their economy, they're not as trade dependent as the others. So they're a little bit less vulnerable. But nevertheless, the reality is China is the world's second biggest economy. It's on its way to becoming the world's biggest economy. And the vulnerability of Asia to China certainly has increased very significantly in the last 5 years or so. So if China has a significant slowdown, the ASEAN countries will be hurt, just as they've, on the other hand, benefited from the strength of China in the last few years.
Okay, final quick question here. Let's take a screen that shows that Indonesia has its aspirations not to go from 6 or 6.4% this year, but to get to 7% and to hold it from 2013 onwards. Is that possible with that consumer market and the domestic growth and the infrastructure build out to hit those sort of numbers?
I think Indonesia is a rising star in Asia. I think it's the next Asian BRIC economy. It's got a population of 250 million. It's been growing at about 6% per year. It's got a good macroeconomics numbers in the last few years, very low government debt to GDP ratio. But I think at the moment its growth potential is around about 6 to 6.5%. And the key bottleneck for their economy is infrastructure. They really need to mobilize substantial new infrastructure investment to accelerate their economy and to create more growth potential. And I think human capital development's another bottleneck as well. So it's a very promising economy. It's probably one of the brightest stars in the emerging markets world, but it does have some challenges on both physical capital and human capital to deal with, and that's a medium-term challenge.